A departure screen flips to closed while a station camera tilts toward me, and my parents disappear. I'm Daniel R., 34, a transit operations analyst from Phoenix, Arizona. The screen's glow pins my eyes before I can choose where to look, white letters sealing a decision that was made without me, and the camera's small mechanical whine tightens the space like a held breath as people stream past with backpacks and coffee cups, unaware that the platform has just turned into a record. I stand beneath the sign long enough to feel the station's rhythm resume around me, the hiss of brakes and the echo of footsteps smoothing over what happened, as if the building were trained to keep moving no matter who fell behind, and I note the angles without trying to camera dome at the ceiling. Seam convex mirror near the kiosk, the way the exit funnels bodies toward daylight, because control has always felt safer than memory. I don't chase them. The consequence is immediate and physical. A security rope sliding into place at the far end of the platform, an attendant's hand hovering near a radio, the exits narrowing as if the station itself is complying with the decision to leave me where I am. And I register the closure, not as emotion but as process. The departure screen hums the word closed, steady, and indifferent, and I step back until my heel meets the tactile strip, the raised bumps, a warning meant for other things, while the camera completes its small arc and settles, recording a stillness that feels staged, even though no one is directing it. The air smells like oil and disinfectant, and the light slices the floor in clean bands that make faces readable, a public brightness that doesn't care what it exposes, and I realize that nothing here requires my consent to document me. An announcement chirps overhead, cheerful and precise listing times and gates, with a confidence that feels rehearsed, and the platform fills again. The crowd's momentum, erasing the gap. My parents left, as if the space were elastic. I think of how stations are designed to keep people moving, how friction is minimized and waiting is organized, and how a system like this can make absence look orderly if it happens between scheduled events. The camera blinks once a tiny red acknowledgement, and I feel the moral weight shift, not because anyone has accused anyone else, but because the environment has already decided what counts: departures, arrivals, closures, all logged without point. Commentary. I take out my phone and don't check it, using the gesture to give my hands a task while I watch an attendant adjust a stanchion, the rope tightening the path, so foot traffic doesn't wander where it shouldn't. A spatial correction that mirrors what just happened to me. Somewhere behind the glass, a monitor updates. The word closed remains, and the station's soundscape smooths over the anomaly with practiced ease. I tell myself to catalog, not to chase the feeling, to note the time by the sun's angle and the schedule board's refresh cycle, to remember that in public spaces, authority shows itself through objects long before it shows itself through people. The moment hardens when the camera locks on and the rope clicks closed, turning a choice into a recorded fact. I move to the edge of the platform where the light cuts cleanly across the concrete and watch the reflection of the screen in the glass wall. Double. The word closed, a visual echo that makes the decision feel final without anyone saying a word. And I understand how silence works here, how it can be deliberate and efficient. A family passes laughing, and the sound lifts and drops as they cross the light bands the station, performing its indifference perfectly, and I think about how often harm hides inside procedures that look like nothing at all. The attendant glances at me, not with suspicion, but with the neutrality of someone trained to keep things flowing, and the glance carries a boundary. This area is done. This movement is complete. I nod as if we've agreed on something, step back to clear the lane, and the consequence settles fully when the exit funnels me toward a different corridor, redirecting my path with the same calm authority as the screen above. The camera remains patient and precise, and I feel the closure press not as panic but as a constraint, a narrowing that tells me what I can't do next. The screen stays closed, the camera keeps watching, and the station decides I am finished here. Years earlier, the morning began with a calm that felt manufactured, the kind that settles when adults move through a space as if the rules were already written and there was no need to explain them to a child. The station was quieter than early enough that the lights hummed louder than the people, and my parents walked with a purpose that made questions feel unnecessary. their steps measured, their voices low and directive, as if efficiency itself were a form of care. I remember the way my mother folded a guest list she'd picked up from a nearby charter desk, creasing it precisely before handing it to me to hold the paper warm from her palm, names and columns blurring together into something that looked official enough to mean safety, and I stood where she placed me because placement felt like protection. The air smelled faintly of oil and floor cleaner, and the platform stretched out in clean lines that suggested order, the kind that promises nothing will go wrong if everyone stays where they're supposed to be, and I watched my father scan the boards without urgency, not checking for time so much as confirming a sequence. They spoke in instructions rather than reassurance, small imperatives about standing still, watching the bags, not wandering, and I complied because compliance had always been framed as responsibility, a way to be good without being loud. The crowd thinned and thickened in gentle waves, and no one paid us particular attention, which I took as confirmation that nothing unusual was happening, that this was simply how travel worked, adults arranging and children waiting. The folded guest list sat heavy in my hands, an object that seemed to carry permission, and I traced the crease with my thumb, the paper resisting, and then yielding the sensation, anchoring me in a task while my parents stepped a little farther away than before. The platform gate rattled once then held. I didn't question the sound at the time. It registered as part of the station's vocabulary, a mechanical punctuation that meant the space was doing its job, and I remember thinking how grown-up everything felt. How stillness could be mistaken for safety when it came wrapped in routine. My parents' faces were composed, almost practiced, their attention divided between me and the space beyond me, and when they adjusted their posture, it looked like preparation rather than departure, a shift that suggested readiness for the next step in a plan I wasn't meant to see. The light cut the concrete into neat bands, making the scene readable without making it intimate, and I stood in one of those bands, holding the list as if it were a ticket to belonging, unaware that objects can authorize silence as easily as they authorize entry. There was no raised voice, no argument, no visible conflict, to warn me that something was wrong. Only a gradual widening of distance, and the way instructions replaced touch hands, withdrawing under the logic of necessity. I noticed my mother avoiding my eyes for a beat longer than usual, then correcting herself, smiling with the kind of assurance that tells you everything is under control, and I mirrored it because mirroring felt like the correct response. The station continued, its low murmur announcements cycling through destinations with equal weight, and nothing in that soundscape announced a breach, which is why the calm felt convincing, why it didn't register as cruelty, but as procedure. My parents moved with the confidence of people who believed the system would catch what they left behind, and I absorbed that belief without understanding its cost, learning in that moment how easily order can disguise absence. Only later did I understand the calm was not kindness but preparation. The first time the past stopped behaving like memory and started behaving like a record was in a county office with windows that didn't open, the kind of place where time is kept by fluorescent hum and the shuffle of paper rather than clocks. I was there years later for something unrelated, a routine request tied to transit operations, when a caseworker paused over my name and reached for a clipboard with an incident log clipped at the top, the metal catching the light as she lifted it with practiced neutrality. The log was thin, utilitarian, and when she turned it toward me, the page showed a time of day stamp in the corner 0914 and a short reference code, 2 letters and a number, followed by a location note that read simply, platform, as if that single word could hold a decision. I felt my posture change before my thoughts. Did shoulders settling into the alignment I use when reviewing schedules, because the consequence arrived immediately. What I'd framed for years as a private fracture was now documented as an operational entry, something noticed, named, and closed. The caseworker spoke carefully, explaining policy without inflection, and I listened for gaps the way I do, when a route doesn't align my eyes, tracking the lines where information should have been, but wasn't the absence louder than the text. The clipboard smelled faintly of cleaner and paper dust, and the room's brightness flattened everything, making it impossible to hide behind shadows. And I realized how that mattered, how clarity can feel more threatening than darkness when it removes ambiguity. I asked for a copy and watched her initial the corner, her pen scratching briefly, the sound marking a transfer of ownership that felt heavier than it should have. And when she slid the page across the desk, I didn't thank her because gratitude didn't fit the exchange. Seeing my childhood reduced to a timestamp and a reference code changed how I stood in my own story. The behavior shift was immediate and practical. I stopped describing the day at the station in emotional terms and started mapping it like a process failure, tracing inputs and outputs, asking who touched what and when, because systems respond to questions even when people don't. The log noted that the situation had been resolved, a word that carried weight without explanation, and I felt the logic fracture there, the clean closure, contradicting the lived consequence of a child redirected into care without ceremony. I asked where the supporting documents were and watched the caseworker's eyes flick to a filing cabinet, a small movement that told me the answer before she spoke, and the room seemed to narrow the air, pressing closer as if to test whether I would push back. She explained retention schedules and jurisdictional limits, the language smooth and well-worn, and I nodded because nodding keeps conversations open, but inside I marked the discrepancy between what was logged and what followed. The clipboard became an anchor, the object that tethered memory to institution, and I noticed how holding it steadied me, how authority can be borrowed from paper long enough to ask better questions. When I left the office, the hallway clock read 11:02, the numbers crisp, and I felt the day reassemble around me with a new alignment, my steps falling into a cadence that matched the certainty of documentation. The fracture wasn't that the system had missed me, it was that it had seen me and chosen efficiency over intervention, and that choice had a timestamp. I folded the copy carefully and slid it into my bag, the paper edge firm against my fingers, and understood that once something is logged, it can be reopened, that closure on a form is not the same as closure in fact. The record didn't accuse anyone, but it shifted the weight until silence itself looked procedural. The Community Safety Forum was staged in the renovated concourse, a bright rectangle carved out by temporary seating, and a low riser, the kind of public space designed to feel accessible while keeping movement controlled. And I arrived early, enough to watch the venue staff test sound levels and sightlines. The wireless mic lay on the glass-top table at the edge of the stage, its matte body absorbing fingerprints, its green indicator blinking with readiness, and the ops lead adjusted a speaker angle so feedback wouldn't distract from the program. A small correction that signaled who held the room. People filtered in, with the mild curiosity reserved for civic events, parents with folded programs, commuters pausing on their way. Through a few city staffers, taking notes and cameras appeared almost by accident, phones lifted a local. Station's shoulder cam settling into position near the kiosk. Because public spaces gather witnesses without asking. I took a seat along the aisle, close enough to see faces clearly far enough to remain unremarkable, and the light did what it always does here, cutting clean bands across the floor that made expressions legible and exits obvious. The moderator welcomed everyone and spoke about safety initiatives, about vigilance, and reporting the language smooth and rehearsed, and when she invited comments, a man near the front raised his hand with the casual confidence of someone who believed he was adding color, not consequence. He took the mic, the green light flaring as it woke, and said he remembered a morning years ago when a kid was left behind on the platform, how it had stuck with him because it looked wrong. Even then, adults walking away while a child stood still, and he'd told someone at the desk, but was told it was handled. The room shifted in that subtle way. Crowds do. When something ordinary turns specific, the first ripple of attention moving from the speaker to the idea itself, and phones lifted higher lenses, finding faces. The witness spoke plainly, not accusing, but the mic made his words durable, and the camera near the kiosk caught the exchange, red tally light steady, as if the building were acknowledging the memory it had archived. I watched the audience's reactions sequence through curiosity to discomfort, a three-beat wave that ended in a hush, and the moderator thanked him and moved on the program, resuming its planned cadence. But the room had already recalibrated the object on the table, having done its work by amplifying a truth that hadn't needed polish. When the mic carried his memory across the concourse, the crowd's silence felt like an admission rather than confusion. I didn't speak, didn't need to. Exposure doesn't always require authorship, only amplification, and the consequence unfolded socially. As people turned to each other, whispers, threading through the seats, eyes darting toward the platform, as if expecting the past to reappear. On cue, the ops lead adjusted the volume slightly, a procedural reflex that kept feedback down and attention focused, and the camera panned once, capturing the audience reaction, the public proof beginning to stack without anyone declaring it. Evidence. I felt the door chain tension in my chest, not panic, but the pressure of controlled access as the exits remained open, yet functionally narrowed by attention, the crowd's focus creating a temporary boundary that kept everyone where they were. The moderator's smile tightened the way it does when a script encounters reality, and she guided the discussion back to prepared talking points, but the witness's line lingered, replayed in murmurs carried by the room's acoustics into corners, where people compare notes. A woman, a row ahead, glanced back at me, and then away, recognition flickering without context, the public beginning to sense a story, even without a narrator. I checked the clock above the departures, no date, just time, watching the minutes advance with the indifference that system's perfect, and I understood that the forum had crossed a threshold. The station was no longer a neutral backdrop, but a participant, its cameras and microphones aligned with a memory that refused to stay private. The mic returned to the table, green light dimming, and a volunteer wiped it down the ritual of hygiene, standing in for closure, but the words it carried couldn't be disinfected away. I stayed seated as the event wrapped, listening to the polite applause that signals completion, and the consequence settled when a city staffer approached the ops lead to ask about archival footage, a question framed as process, but heavy with implication. People filed out slowly, some lingering to talk, some avoiding eye contact, the witness stepping aside to answer questions he hadn't expected, and I watched how public attention creates its own gravity, pulling details toward it. The station lights brightened incrementally as afternoon leaned toward evening, faces still readable the space, refusing to hide anyone, and I felt the advantage of patience of letting objects and witnesses speak first. By the time the mic went dark, the station had accepted a memory it could no longer file away. The intake office was smaller than I expected, a narrow room softened by a plant that never quite recovered, and a desk lamp positioned to make paperwork feel personal, and the sealed legal envelope waited in the center of the desk, like a promise delayed too long to matter when it was first made. The caseworker slid it toward me without ceremony, her movements, efficient eyes trained on procedure, and when I broke the seal, the paper resisted briefly before yielding the sound sharp in the quiet, an action that carried consequence, the moment it happened. Inside was a copy of a youth intake form, the kind designed to compress a life into fields and checkboxes, and I noticed the masked identifier suffix near the top, and the intake time stamped neatly along the margin, a small cluster of numbers that anchored the document to a morning I knew too well. The form listed found at platform under circumstances language that sidestepped intent with professional grace, and as I read, my breathing slowed not from relief, but from the clarity that comes when contradiction resolves into pattern. I sat back, the envelope open on the desk between us, and the consequence registered immediately. This wasn't a temporary separation that drifted out of control. It was an entry point, a handoff from family to system, executed without hesitation. The room's light flattened everything, making the words unavoidable, and the plant's leaves cast thin shadows that felt ornamental rather than protective, a reminder that comfort here was aesthetic, not functional. I asked how the intake connected to the earlier incident log, and the caseworker's answer stayed within policy, careful to outline jurisdictional handoffs without assigning motive, but the logic fracture was already there, visible in the gap between resolved and intake, between closure and consequence. The envelope didn't reveal new facts so much as force the system's story to contradict itself. I traced the line where my name should have been fully spelled out, the omission, feeling deliberate even if it wasn't intended that way, and I felt the shift in myself from inquiry to audit the stance that treats silence as a data point, rather than an absence. The form included a generic location tag and a case routing note initialed by someone I didn't recognize, and I marked both mentally knowing initials are how responsibility moves without names, how accountability thins as it travels. The caseworker offered water, and I declined, not out of distrust, but because accepting would slow the exchange, and time mattered now. Not in urgency, but in alignment. Every document needed to be read against the others, while their edges were still sharp. The envelope's interior was faintly lined, the paper stock heavier than the copy itself, and I realized how presentation can lend weight to delay, how sealing something can make inaction feel intentional rather than negligent. When I slid the form back into the envelope, I did it carefully, preserving its condition because objects like this gain authority by surviving intact, by being ready to be produced again when the room changes. The caseworker closed the file and noted the request in her system, the keystrokes quiet and final, and I stood with the form under my arm, the consequence settling into place as a reframe. My parents' version hadn't failed. It had been bypassed by design. I thanked her this time, not for the help, but for the transaction, and stepped into the hallway, where the light was harsher and the air cooler the building, guiding me forward with the same neutrality it had always perfected. The intake form had done its work by breaking the logic that kept abandonment abstract, and as I walked out, I understood that preparation had followed me from the platform into policy, that the calm I remembered had a paper trail after all. Once the intake existed, the story stopped being about a mistake and started being about a decision. The projector remote was lighter than it looked, a smooth plastic wand that fit easily in my palm, and I tested its range while the meeting room filled with the low murmur of people settling into seats, the kind of space designed to convert attention into order. The legal ally sat to my left, papers stacked precisely, while the ops ally checked sightlines and adjusted the screen's angle, so glare wouldn't soften the image, and the consequence of preparation showed itself immediately as the room fell into a disciplined, quiet exits, visible doors closed but not locked. When the first slide appeared, it showed two system entries side by side, both referencing the same morning but stamped with different times, minutes apart, yet decisive in policy terms, and I felt the shift in my posture as the discrepancy registered not as confusion but as confirmation. The timestamps glowed white against a dark background, clean and undeniable, and the projector's fan hummed steadily, a mechanical insistence that kept the room focused on the comparison. Every record closed, but the chain still pulled. The contradiction altered behavior instantly. The legal ally leaned forward, pen poised, while a city staffer in the second row raised a hand and then lowered it, the question deferred by the clarity of the display. The ops ally clicked the remote, once advancing to a log that showed an automatic delay between report and intake, a window small enough to be dismissed individually, but damning in aggregate, and I watched faces tighten as the implication landed without being named. The room's lighting was bright enough to read expressions clearly, the public clarity stripping away the comfort of plausible deniability, and I noticed how silence here felt heavier than argument, a pause weighted by the knowledge that systems don't misalign without reason. I explained the operational impact in neutral terms, pointing to process flow and handoff points, careful not to accuse because accusation invites defense, while demonstration invites recalibration, and the projector did the accusing for me, the object turning absence into evidence. The consequence continued to unfold as questions shifted from whether something happened to how it was allowed to settle the conversation, tightening around responsibility without yet naming it, and the legal ally slid a note toward me with a single word underlined, a reminder that timing governs authority as much as proof. The projector remote warmed slightly in my hand, the plastic absorbing heat as the session extended, and I felt the door chain tension not as fear but as resistance, the pull of a mechanism designed to delay action until a threshold was crossed. When the ops alley dimmed the lights a fraction to sharpen contrast, the timestamps grew more legible, the cut line of light across the room, reinforcing the divide between what was logged and what was lived, and the room leaned in collectively. A witness wave beginning to form without anyone prompting. A staffer asked about retention policies, another about escalation paths, and each question conceded the premise that the discrepancy mattered, the behavioral shift that signals a system preparing to correct itself. I didn't raise my voice or add detail. Restraint kept the focus where it belonged, on the mismatch that refused to resolve, and the consequence settled into the agenda, as the chair called for a follow-up session, dates to be set, materials to be circulated. The projector clicked off the screen, retracting with a soft whir, and the room exhaled, but the pull remained, the chain not yet lifted, only tightened by the knowledge that timing had been manipulated. As we packed up, the legal ally met my eye and nodded once the signal that the window was opening but not yet open, and I placed the remote back on the table, aligning it with the edge, an instinctive gesture of control. When the lights came back up, the room understood that delay had been engineered, not accidental. The venue keycard felt heavier than plastic should a small rectangle that controlled more than doors if you understood how spaces were governed, and I slid it from my wallet as the ops ally met us near the service corridor, the public concourse just beyond the glass, humming with ordinary traffic. The card granted access with a muted beep, the latch releasing cleanly, and the immediate consequence was spatial. We stepped into a quieter channel, where conversations carried farther, and time seemed to slow, a controlled environment where pressure could be applied without spectacle. Inside, the back office, fluorescent lights flattened the room into a grid of desks and monitors, and the legal ally set her papers down with the precision of someone who knew exactly what could and couldn't be done. Yet the line between preparation and action drawn sharply in her posture. I didn't sit. Standing kept me aligned with exits, and screens kept the sense of readiness alive, and I watched the ops ally pull up an internal email thread on a terminal. The header information crisp, the subject line neutral enough to pass without notice if you didn't know what to look for. The message showed a routing decision made years ago, initials in the corner, a time of day stamp that placed it squarely between the incident log and the intake form, the missing link that explained how responsibility moved without stopping anywhere long enough to be held. The effect was immediate and behavioral. The ops ally leaned back, hands off the keyboard, acknowledging the weight of what the screen now carried, and the legal ally exhaled once controlled before asking a single clarifying question about access levels, her voice steady as a metronome. The email didn't accuse anyone, but it showed how silence had been forwarded on purpose. I felt the door chain tension tighten, not as fear, but as anticipation, the mechanism pulling against itself as the system prepared to correct course only when compelled to do so publicly. The ops ally explained limitations, what could be shared when, and under whose authority, and each boundary landed like a rung on a ladder, something to climb deliberately rather than rush, because premature escalation collapses credibility, faster than delay. The venue keycard rested on the desk between us, a reminder that entry was conditional and revocable, that power in public spaces is often exercised through access rather than voice, and I noticed how the card's edge caught the light, a thin type line that made it visible even when no one was holding it. We discussed timing, without dates, windows without calendars, the language careful to avoid specificity, while still creating constraint, because clock pressure works best when it's felt rather than announced. Outside the office, a group laughed as they passed the sound filtering through the glass, a reminder that public life continues, even as its scaffolding is adjusted behind the scenes, and the contrast sharpened my focus. The legal ally outlined the next steps in conditional terms, emphasizing the need for undeniable public proof before authority could enter without risking dismissal, and I nodded, the logic aligning with everything the objects had already taught me. Objects open doors, proof keeps them open. The ops ally forwarded the email to a secure folder, the send confirmation appearing briefly on the screen, and that small action carried consequence, shifting the thread from private obscurity into a traceable path, a move that couldn't be undone without leaving a mark. I asked who had initiated the message back then, and the answer came with a pause, initials decoded into a role rather than a name. the system's preferred way of distributing accountability until it evaporates. The pressure in the room increased not because voices rose, but because options narrowed, the familiar feeling of a corridor closing, as doors remained unlocked yet effectively out of reach until conditions were met. I pocketed the keycard when we finished the plastic warm now, and the weight felt earned a signal that access had been granted for a purpose that wasn't yet complete. As we stepped back into the concourse, the light brightened, and faces became readable again, the public clarity returning like a flood. And I caught my reflection in the glass, composed and unremarkable, exactly how leverage looks before it's used. The ops ally peeled off to manage the floor, already thinking in terms of sightlines and sound, while the legal ally stayed beside me, her presence, a quiet assurance that process could be bent without breaking if the sequence was respected. The consequence of the email continued to unfold as phones buzzed and staff adjusted schedules the building, responding to an invisible shift in gravity, and I felt the moment when patience stops being passive and becomes strategic. Holding the keycard, I understood the next risk wasn't exposure, it was moving too soon and letting the door swing back. The time-stamped CCTV still appeared first as a thumbnail on the monitor, a grainy rectangle framed by interface borders, and when the ops ally enlarged it, the room adjusted around the image chairs, scraping softly as people leaned forward to see what had been hidden in plain sight. The still showed the platform from above, the clock overlay, clear in the corner, 0857. Numbers sharp enough to anchor memory to a minute, and the figure at the center was unmistakable. A child standing where an adult should have returned. The object did its work immediately. Conversation stopped, not out of politeness, but because the image collapsed, speculation into certainty, and I felt the behavioral shift ripple through the room as hands dropped from pens and phones stilled mid-gesture. The ops ally toggled between frames with a practiced tap, the audio muted by default, and each frame confirmed the sequence the logs had tried to blur adults, moving out of frame while the child remained the camera indifferent and exact. The still didn't argue, it fixed the truth to a time the system couldn't talk around. I watched faces register the contradiction as a physical thing, brows tightening, mouths flattening, the kind of recognition that carries consequence because it leaves no room to retreat into interpretation. The legal ally didn't speak. She didn't need to because authority waits for undeniability, and the image had crossed that threshold without raising its voice. The light in the room was bright enough to read reactions clearly, and the cut line across the table made the divide between past and present visible, the moment when a record stops being archival and becomes actionable. The ops ally pointed out the overlay, the location tag, the continuity between frames. His voice measured procedural, and each clarification narrowed the corridor of excuses until there was nowhere left to stand comfortably. I felt the door chain tension shift from pull to lift, not released yet, but changing direction, the mechanism responding to load in a way anyone who understands systems recognizes as imminent movement. The still was exported to a secure drive, the confirmation tone soft but decisive, and that sound carried its own consequence, transferring the image from review to record, from discussion to preparation. Someone asked whether the parents had contested the timeline, and the legal ally answered with a single sentence that ended the question without escalating it, her restraint signaling confidence rather than caution. I noticed my own breathing slow, the habit of control returning as the room's focus tightened around the object, and I realized how reversal feels when it arrives quietly, not with confrontation but with alignment when everyone sees the same thing at the same time. The ops ally minimized the image, and the screen went dark for a beat. The absence louder than the presence had been, and then he brought it back full size, a deliberate repetition that reinforced its authority without dramatics. The consequence continued to unfold as schedules shifted and a public slot was identified, not named yet but implied, by the way people checked their watches and phones, the clock pressure beginning to build, without a date attached. Outside the room, the concourse noise filtered in ordinary and oblivious, and the contrast sharpened the sense that something had tipped, that the power to define the story had moved hands. I packed my notes slowly, giving the still time to settle into the room's collective memory, because rushing undermines inevitability, and inevitability is what forces systems to act. When we stood chairs pushing back in unison, the ops alley met my eye and nodded once the smallest acknowledgement that the stage was set, and the next move would be public. The door opened and light spilled in faces, becoming readable again the building, ready to host the truth it had once archived without comment. As the image followed us out, I knew the reversal was complete because the room had stopped asking what happened and started asking when. The audio recorder was older than everything else on the table, a scuffed black rectangle with a red button, worn smooth by repetition, and I set it down between us as if placement alone could give it authority, the consequence arriving. Moment, its presence redirected attention away from screens and toward sound. The ops alley checked the levels once, headphones cupped over one ear and nodded when the waveform jumped cleanly, the device ready to do the work, cameras couldn't, while the legal alley folded her hands and waited posture, signaling that the decision had narrowed to timing rather than proof. When the recording played, it was a voicemail routed through the service desk, a clipped voice explaining a situation resolved. The words chosen carefully, the tone brisk, and then a pause that stretched just long enough to hear a second voice. In the background, asking whether the parents had followed, through the question half muffled but unmistakable. The effect was immediate and physical. Someone across the table shifted in their chair, another reached for a pen and stopped the room, recalibrating as intent surfaced, not as accusation but as admission embedded in routine. The recorder's speaker crackled softly, the sound unpolished and therefore credible, and I felt the corridor of options constrict, the door chain tension tightening into a single hinge point, where delay would now look like avoidance. Hearing the plan spoken aloud made the past sound like policy instead of accident. I watched the legal ally's eyes flick to the clock on the wall, not a date, just the time, and understood the pressure that comes when windows are measured in minutes rather than days, when public attention can be guided but not held indefinitely. The ops alley stopped the playback and rewound a few seconds, replaying the pause, where the second voice intruded a deliberate repetition that fixed the implication in the room's memory, without commentary, and the consequence deepened as the sound lodged itself where denials usually live. I asked when the parents had initiated contact years later, and the answer came with a glance at a call log, the timing aligning uncomfortably close to the recent public forum, the sequence suggesting motive without requiring inference. The recorder stayed on the table, red button dark its silence, now heavier than the sound had been, and I realized that choosing when to let something be heard is as important as choosing what is heard, that restraint preserves leverage longer than exposure. The legal ally outlined the remaining steps in conditional language, her voice low and exact, emphasizing that authority could only enter after public proof crossed a threshold that no one could dispute, and I nodded, the logic matching the fire rhythm that had carried us this far. The ops ally mentioned sightlines and crowd, flow, the practicalities of a public stage, and each detail tightened the timeline without announcing it, the building already beginning to anticipate an event it hadn't scheduled. Outside, the room announcements echoed through the concourse, ordinary and indifferent, and the contrast sharpened the sense that a choice was being made in the quiet that would soon echo loudly. I picked up the recorder and felt its weight heavier now, not because of the plastic, but because of what it carried, and I understood that the next move would close a door permanently, not just tighten it. The risk wasn't being believed anymore. It was whether the truth would land with enough witnesses to force the system's hand before it tried to soften the blow. I slid the recorder back into my bag, not as retreat, but as preparation, knowing that objects gain force when they arrive exactly where they're meant to be heard. With the recorder silent and the clock moving, the only decision left was how public the truth needed to be. The glass podium was positioned at the center of the concourse, transparent enough to look harmless and solid enough to anchor a room, and I arrived early to watch how the space assembled itself around it, chairs aligned to face forward, stanchions adjusted to keep sightlines clean, the ops ally moving, with a quiet efficiency that turned flow into control. Bright public lighting washed the area evenly, faces readable from every angle, and the station's cameras were no longer incidental. They were part of the architecture now. Lenses, fixed red indicators steady the building, prepared to remember. People gathered with the loose anticipation that comes when something has been hinted at but not named, Phones lifted, not to record yet but to be ready, and I stood just off stage, letting the room settle into its own attention. The legal ally checked the document one last time, the certified abandonment record held flat against the podium's surface, so the seal could be seen without being emphasized, and the consequence of preparation showed itself as the crowd quieted, without instruction, the hush spreading in a clean wave, as if the space had been trained to respond. The ops ally nodded, a signal not to me but to the room, and I stepped forward, placing my hands lightly on the podium's edge, the cool glass grounding me in the present, as the station's ambient noise receded into a disciplined silence. I didn't open with emotion or history. I stated purpose, named the process, and then read from the record exactly as it was written, the language formal, the classification precise, the time of day stamp and location included, so no one could pretend it was abstract. The words traveled cleanly in the bright air carried by microphones, calibrated to avoid distortion, and I watched the audience's reactions sequence, from recognition to discomfort to stillness, the witness wave completing its arc as the truth landed where everyone could see it. When the certified record was read aloud under full light, denial lost its last place to stand. Phones rose in unison now, recording not a confrontation but a confirmation. The glass podium, reflecting faces back at themselves. The transparency forcing alignment between what was said and what was seen. I paused to let the language do its work, resisting the urge to add commentary, because commentary invites debate, while documentation closes doors, and the station's screens behind me cycled through ordinary information, as if nothing extraordinary were happening. The contrast underscoring how systems absorb shock by staying procedural. The legal ally stepped forward, then not to accuse but to mark transition, her voice calm as she explained what the classification meant and what it triggered: the words public record and mandatory review, landing with weight precisely because they were expected, not dramatic. Only after the room had accepted the proof did the authority enter, a uniformed official, approaching from the side corridor, badge catching the light for a brief, unmistakable moment, before stopping just short of the podium, the timing exact. The sequence respected. The official didn't speak immediately. The presence was enough. The consequence of the record already in motion, and the ops ally adjusted the crowd flow subtly, creating a clear aisle without calling attention to it. The choreography keeping the focus where it belonged. I saw my parents, then not center stage but visible, their faces registering the shift from private narrative to public fact, the glass podium, reflecting them back in fragments. And I noted the absence of argument, the way authority removes the oxygen from denial, by making it procedural. The official acknowledged receipt of the record, confirmed next steps in neutral language, and the room responded with a murmur that wasn't applause or outrage, but relief, the sound people make when a truth finally has somewhere to go. The station's clock advanced by a minute, indifferent and precise, and the legal ally concluded with a single sentence about accountability that framed what followed as process rather than punishment, a distinction that kept the focus on correction instead of spectacle. Cameras continued to record. As the official escorted the conversation off stage, the glass podium left momentarily empty, its transparency now a symbol of what had just happened, rather than an object to lean on. I stepped back, letting the space reclaim itself, the public clarity holding long enough for the proof to settle into memory, and I felt the door chain tension release, not as triumph, but as completion. The mechanism lifting, because the will to load had been carried properly. People began to speak again in low tones, comparing notes, sharing links, the truth dispersing through the crowd with the efficiency of a well-designed transit hub, and I knew there would be questions later, commentary and spin, but a sequence had already done its work. The authority lingered just long enough to be unmistakable, and then moved on, the badge's glint, disappearing into the corridor, the consequence continuing, without needing to be watched. I left the podium where it was untouched, the glass reflecting the overhead lights in clean lines, and stepped aside as staff began the quiet work of resetting the space chairs. Realigned stanchions eased back the station, returning to function with a new record now embedded in its routine. As the crowd dispersed under the same bright lights, the truth stayed standing where the podium had been. The printed notice letter arrived, folded once, clean and uncreased, the kind of paper that carries authority by looking untouched, and I held it at the edge rather than opening it immediately, letting its presence set the tone for what followed. We were in a smaller conference room this time, away from the concourse, but still within the building's public spine, glass walls keeping the space visible without inviting interruption, and the legal ally placed a copy on the table in front of each party, with the calm efficiency of someone closing a loop. The letter summarized actions already set in motion. Mandatory review initiated findings, entered into public record, referrals made where policy required, and the consequence was immediate and procedural, not dramatic. The kind of justice that doesn't raise its voice because it doesn't need to. My parents sat across from me, their posture adjusted to the room's neutrality, no longer controlling the narrative through absence or delay, and I watched how the shift manifested physically, shoulders tight, hands still eyes, tracking the paper rather than my face. The legal ally explained the next steps in plain language, emphasizing timelines without dates, obligations without threats, and each sentence narrowed the corridor until accountability became the only forward motion available. The letter didn't punish. It corrected the record where silence had been allowed to stand. I opened mine, then reading not for vindication, but for alignment, confirming that the classification matched what had been read publicly, that the language was consistent, because consistency is how systems signal seriousness. The room's light was even and unflattering faces readable without being exposed, and I felt the door chain tension loosen fully for the first time, not snapping free, but lifting as if the mechanism had finally recognized the load was gone. One of my parents tried to speak a reflex rather than a plan, and the legal ally gently redirected the moment back to process, reminding everyone that statements would be taken in sequence at the appropriate time, the correction firm without being cruel. The consequence of that redirection was silence, not imposed but accepted, the understanding that this phase wasn't about stories but about compliance, and I noticed how quickly the room adapted, how order reasserts itself once the truth has a place to sit. The ops ally stood by the door unobtrusive, a visible assurance that boundaries would hold if needed, and the presence alone was enough to keep the exchange contained. I said very little, answering questions when asked, declining when they weren't, because payoff doesn't require performance, only completion, and the letter did most of the speaking. For me, its printed words carrying farther than any explanation could. The legal ally collected signatures where required, the pen scratching softly, each mark another confirmation that the system was acknowledging what it had once smoothed over, and I watched the process with the same attention I give to schedules and routes, noting how resolution moves through institutions when it's been properly triggered. When the meeting ended, there was no confrontation, no catharsis in the cinematic sense, just a clear sense of sequence fulfilled, the weight transferred from private memory to public correction, and that felt sufficient. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in my bag, not as a trophy, but as documentation, something to be archived, because archives are where accountability lives longer than anger. Outside the room, the building's hum returned familiar and indifferent, and I walked the corridor without needing to scan exits, my pace steady, my attention no longer pulled by the need to anticipate. The ops ally nodded once as I passed, a professional acknowledgement that the plan had executed as intended, and the legal ally offered a small, satisfied smile that didn't linger already, turning toward her next task. I stepped into the concourse and blended into the flow, the public space, accepting me. Without resistance, the payoff delivered not in applause, but in the quiet correction of a record that would outlast us all. Justice arrived not as revenge but as a system finally doing its job. I returned to the station in the present, not to revisit the past, but to confirm that it no longer controls my movement, and the door latch chain near the service corridor catches my attention as I pass its metal links resting loose against the frame instead of pulled taut, a small mechanical detail that feels like a verdict rendered without ceremony. The concourse hums with its usual indifference announcements, cycling footsteps, overlapping light, cutting clean lines across the floor. And nothing here pauses to acknowledge what has been corrected, which is how systems prefer their repairs. Quiet, embedded, permanent. I stop briefly, near the spot where the podium stood days ago, now indistinguishable from the rest of the floor. The glass long gone, the chairs redistributed, the space absorbed back into routine, and I notice how easily public memory yields to function once the record has been set. The camera dome above still turns on its slow arc, patient and exact, and I let it pass over me, without adjusting my posture, the consequence of resolution showing itself in the absence of vigilance rather than its display. The station smells the same as it always has, oil and disinfectant, and the light still makes faces readable, but the pull I used to feel here is gone, replaced by a neutrality that no longer feels threatening. I think about how objects carried me through this sequence, the screen, the mic, the podium, and how each did its work and then disappeared, leaving behind a changed alignment that doesn't need reminders to persist. The door latch chain shifts slightly as someone exits links, whispering against metal, and the sound registers as ordinary. Now no longer a metaphor demanding interpretation, just hardware doing what it's meant to do. I walk the length of the platform without scanning for attendants or ropes, noticing details I once catalogued, defensively now registering as background, the difference between observation for control and observation for presence. A family waits near the schedule board, a child bouncing on their heels, and I don't read into it. I let the scene remain what it is without projecting an outcome, trusting that correction doesn't require me to stand guard. The station's clock advances minute by minute, precise and indifferent, and I'm aware of time again as movement rather than pressure. The clock pressure ladder dismantled, now that it has served its purpose. I pass the service corridor and glance once at the latch, not to test it, but to acknowledge that access is no longer being negotiated, that the mechanism has returned to baseline where it belongs. The building accepts me as another body in transit, and that acceptance feels earned, not through endurance but through alignment, the system recognizing what it once misfiled. I exit into daylight without hesitation, the doors opening smoothly, the street noise rising to meet me, and I don't look back because there's nothing left inside that needs watching. The record exists where it should, the correction in motion beyond my supervision, and the quiet after justice feels less like emptiness than like space reclaimed. The chain lifts, the doors open, and I walk forward without being recorded anymore.